Hi, I'm Andrew Cain, State Politics Editor at the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and with me is my colleague, politics reporter Dave Ress. We're here to talk about early voting about a week into the process. Dave, I understand in talking to registrars, there's some brisk business out there.
Oh, yeah. The registrar in Richmond, Keith Ballmer, was saying he'd never seen anything like the first day of voting. There were more than 1,000 people. So it actually had to kind of feel like the last day of early voting when there's that big rush to get your vote in for sure, which is kind of interesting. Generally, though, they're saying it's been pretty busy.
That is interesting. We had about 2.8 million folks in Virginia cast early ballots in the 2020 presidential election. And, that includes both in-person early voting as well as mail voting. But in 2020, we were in the midst of the pandemic. And now it seems like the pace is keeping pace, even though we're thankfully out of the pandemic.
Well, so far, actually, about a week into it, we're slightly ahead on early voting, about nearly 180,000 compared to about 168,000 in 2020. Part of it is Henrico's registrar was saying, people, it was a new thing in 2020. People have, since then found they kind of like the convenience. You don't have to worry about, am I going to be stuck in a line on election day? I can come in later on in the period, be able to come in on Saturdays in many localities. So it seems to be becoming part of the way that we vote now in America, at least in Virginia.
Interesting. One aspect of the early results that is interesting is that our friends over at the Virginia Public Access Project have broken down the numbers by congressional district, and at least in the early going, we're taping this Thursday afternoon, the largest number of early votes cast so far are in congressional districts that traditionally have skewed Republican, including the 1st, which goes into our suburbs, as well as the 5th district, the 6th district in the Valley, and the 9th district down in Southwest Virginia. So one interesting aspect of this is it sort of harkens back to how Governor Glenn Youngkin won the election for governor in 2021. He tried to keep the margin down in Northern Virginia, but he tried to strengthen the strength by pushing Republicans' advantage in a lot of red rural counties. What are you hearing?
I'm hearing stuff like that, but with a big caution. One of the big changes, of course, in Virginia, after a governor takes office, the composition of the local electoral boards that make all the decisions about how the vote's going to get conducted locally changed. There used to be 2-to-1 Democratic. After a Republican governor, it's 2-to-1 Republican. And that can mean things that actually has happened in some localities. Prince William, for instance, where there were many places where you could go and vote remote. There is only one now. So that can affect things. The other thing that I've been hearing is that, we're seeing big increases in turnout in counties and counties mostly that are, very heavily Republican. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's Republicans going to the poll. And if you want to get into the weeds, which I know you and I both like to do, one of the real phenomenon about get out the vote efforts in the past several years has been the sophistication of tracking. And so now it's possible for parties to get regular updates of voting lists, including who's already cast a ballot. And they can check that against their databases of who has voted, for instance, in a Democratic or Republican primary in years past. And I'm hearing from Democrats who may not be the most impartial that these initial returns are saying even in some of these very Republican counties, we're actually seeing a lot of those votes coming from Democrats. So take some of the stuff with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and we know from past practice that there is a big Democratic vote in Northern Virginia, particularly in presidential years. We'll just have to see how that manifests itself, whether it's skewed more toward day of voting or whether it's early voting in person ultimately or by mail. One interesting thing that we saw in the last week or so is former President Trump joined Governor Youngkin calling into a tele-rally in Virginia on Sunday night to urge people to vote early. Now, as we know, the former president has criticized early voting, at least a window for early voting in the past, suggesting that it could be an avenue for fraud. But he encouraged people to take advantage of that in Virginia. He goes out to Pennsylvania the next day. He again urges early voting, but then he criticizes it, calling it stupid, particularly the 45-day window in Pennsylvania. So a little bit of a mixed message there.
I think actually ultimately the message is this, that, we will be voting for 45 days until the first Tuesday in November. And we'll have late in the night on the first Tuesday in November a count, an unofficial count. Because what then happens is what a lot of us forget about is that for the next several days, all of those local electoral boards will be taking all those tapes and doing about, I always lose count, but I think it's at least 3 separate arithmetic checks to be sure that all the numbers match. And the final thing that they report to the State Board of Elections as an official result is actually what people voted. And it's always good to remember that.
Right. So it might take a while for this result to ultimately shake out in Virginia and particularly nationwide. So I want to thank my colleague Dave Ress, and we encourage all of you to continue to follow our coverage on richmond.com and in the Richmond Times-Dispatch.